up in the morning, you went to labor for 12 hours, dropped to bed because you're too tired at the end of it. Came as a small child. If you were lucky, you went to school for a few years, 30 years in stable labor, 2 years of retirement, drop dead. Blocks of time. In a tertiary society, we don't have any sense of time control. We're having to use our time in so many different ways. So many things are going on. We have to use 15% of our time every year in retraining, says the experts. All of us. We have to work for the state to work out all these bureaucracies. We have to work on reproduction. We have no sense of control of time. And yet, we don't have a sense of how we measure it. Our labor statistics are a shocking disgrace. They are. I was a member of the International Committee of Labor Statisticians, and I was even actually on an advisory board for the Presidential Commission on Labor Statistics. I've been arguing this for years, and a lot of people will be honest enough to admit it. Our labor statistics are a distortionary image. If they produce figures saying the average worker works 8.2 hours a day for 5 days a week, don't believe it. We produce the figures, they're put in the media and everything. It's absolute rubbish. Many people have to work much more in doing work for labor than is measured in the actual labor they spend in a workplace. We all know that. Anybody who does the standard hours is a rarity. We all have to do many forms. And yet, we have no conception of the amount of work that people do. And it is a travesty because it affects the precariat big time. Because you can work it out very quickly, and I hope the relevant chapter shows it, that the precariat has to do a much more work for labor and much more other forms of work than the salariat who has a controlled trajectory for their life. All right? That part is very much part of the increasing stress. Now I'll shift quickly to who is in the precariat. I'm going to just mention a few things and hope that you'll look in the book for a more detailed story. The first answer is all of us potentially. Any of us could drift into the precariat, or our children could, or our friends and relatives. We're only an accident away. Don't be too smug. I was interviewed by a prominent television channel recently, and the producer phoned me up the following morning. It's a big channel. And he said, Guy, I didn't know him. He said, Guy, I just wanted to tell you that actually I feel I'm going to join the precariat any day now. You know, a lot of people feel they could easily drift into it, right? Which helps in a sense because it's reducing the smugness that would otherwise exist. But clearly there are groups that have a relatively high propensity to be entering the precariat. That includes youth, I've been talking about, includes women, of course. Women have traditionally been forced into precariatized circumstances and now have a quadruple burden and all that sort of thing going on. And they make up a very big proportion of the precariat. But we also have the old agers entering it, often instrumentally because they like to have something to do. They don't want a career, but many of them are forced by other circumstances. We have the disabled, a ridiculous development where we're remedicalizing disability in order for governments to be able to cut on their disability benefits and force the disabled, particularly people with episodic disabilities, back into the low-wage labor market. I found the Supreme Court's ruling on what should constitute capacity to work recently so bizarre I had to go and read it to make sure that it said what I thought it said, and it does. The fact that you restrict the definition and force more people who do have disabilities, suddenly they're not qualifying for disability benefits. And there are cases of people who have to spend years instead of months trying to prove eligibility to this, and it's happening globally. You also have the criminalized, the vast number of criminalized that we are creating in our societies. You are not alone there. France, for example, has trebled the number of people in prison in the last 15 years. The Netherlands has done the same. Every day an extra 700 people in Italy becomes criminalized. But often for new crimes that weren't crimes 20 years ago. We have an increasing tendency to incarcerate. We all know the story, if the sociologists know the story. And most of all, you have the migrants. Now, the migrants are both the victims and increasingly depicted as the villains in the Precariat. They have a very strange position. We have more migrants than at any time in history, but the character of modern migration is increasingly circular rather than settler migration. A much higher percentage are circular. And there are just two aspects that I want to emphasize, because I think we're all familiar with the nature of migrants going into casual jobs and being exploited, etc. We know that story. But there are two things I want to mention. The first is the biggest migratory flow at the moment consists of all those Chinese migrants going from the rural areas into Shenzhen and all the other urban areas where our companies are using them as short-term disposable, literally in many cases, labor, because they haven't got the hukou, they haven't got the residence permits, and the system deliberately makes sure that they're living temporary labor lives in extreme insecurity, earning pittance. That phenomenon is dragging more people elsewhere into the precariat, right? But the second thing is rather more sinister than that, even more sinister, which is that we are seeing the emergence of labor export regimes. China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, a number of other countries are organizing through the state the transfer of hundreds of thousands of workers to various other parts of the world to work on a project-by-project basis. They have no secure employment contracts. They have no secure incomes. They are easy to manage. One reason being is a high percentage of them are convicts. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people being moved around. And if you think it only applies in Africa and Asia and possibly Latin America, get real. Recently, the Polish government put out to tender a contract to renovate its highway system, much needed. And of course, the tender was won by a Chinese state capital firm. And they, to win the tender, they had an agreement they would bring in their own workers, large numbers of their own workers, to do the jobs, paid those low wages. But to add a little bit of irony to that, as if there's not irony already, they received a subsidy from the European Union to reduce their costs. So I, as a European taxpayer, am subsidizing the influx of essentially a convict Chinese labor to lower the wages around Europe. Don't think places like Sweden have been avoiding it. In the forests, they've imported thousands of Chinese migrant workers to do the blueberry picking and all other sorts of activities, and are undercutting low wages for low-paid precariat. And there's a poem that was spotted on a dormitory door of one of these groups of Chinese. And the poem goes, "We are all people floating around in the world. We meet each other, but we never really get to know each other." And I think that's a wonderfully poignant poem of the global precariat. The final question: where is the precariat taking us? The two chapters that relate to this, the last two chapters, are A Politics of Inferno with apologies to Dante, and you can guess the final chapter, which is A Politics of Paradise. Now, the politics of Inferno goes something like this. Mark doesn't want to hear this, and I well understand, because it could happen to him.
Everybody here, it's not going to happen to me, though.
The politics of Inferno goes something like this. That we become increasingly societies of denizens, not citizens, where we lose by one means or another rights that we thought we had. We see yawning inequalities, growing insecurities, where governments become more explicitly utilitarian and resort to Bentham's panopticon system for punishing and dealing with the losers in society. The panopticon, which not only punishes those people, but says they have to be blamed for their plight. We see workfare becoming increasingly punitive. In other words, coercing people. End welfare as we know it, said Clinton, and they've sure meant it. And that is growing around the world. Increasingly forcing the losers to do onerous forms of unpaid or miserably paid labor that's indignifying and a disgrace on all of us. But if you have a utilitarianism which says the happiness of the greatest number must be looked after, never mind the minority, and that I've heard said, then you get that sort of development. You have the worst thing of the politics of Inferno, and there are other aspects, is the distinct possibility that you will have the development of a neo-fascist populism, playing on the fears of those inside that first part of the Precariat, and many who fear they're falling into it or their children are falling into it, who will listen to the sirens of the Tea Partiers and the fascists in Italy and in all over Europe. It's frightening that they are growing everywhere. Very nearly they won the Swedish general election. Even more nearly, the far right nearly won the Finnish general election. These were the nirvanas of social democracy, the Scandinavian model of decency, etc. We're seeing it in Italy, the Northern League, which are openly fascist. We're seeing it in Hungary. We're seeing it almost everywhere. It is a terrifying threat, and we should not be sanguine that it's going to be defeated. But I am an optimist, and therefore I have that final chapter. And I'll just tell you a little bit about it in the vague hope that there will be sufficient interest that you want to buy the book and read the book, because I can't go into the richness in the time available that I think the new vision that is emerging. Clearly this year we have seen the primitive rebel stage of a Polanyian great transformation, a global transformation. We are at the crisis point of that transformation, where the globalization period dominated by financial capital multiplied forms of insecurity and inequality until we reached a crisis point. And if you remember Polanyi's term, there is at that point a risk of the annihilation of civilization. There is that risk, but I think we will beat it. And if you think about it, the politics of paradise begins with remembering history. And at every point of a transformation, the next forward march towards more civilized, more egalitarian society is defined by the needs and aspirations of the emerging mass class. And that class is the precariat that is growing. And every forward march, historically, has been led by new forms of collective action and collective struggle. They haven't been the same